What is the biblical definition of something which is unclean?
Well, the unclean animals obviously were unclean for ceremonial reasons, but I believe there are scientific reasons why they should also be unfit for human consumption. For example, if we look at the long list of animals listed there, most of those that are unclean fall into the category of what we would call carnivores or scavengers. Now, these animals accumulate more toxins than those that are closer to the base diet, which would be plant foods. So the lowest trophic level, the lowest feeding level in any ecological system would be the plants.
Mm-hmm.
Now, those that are specifically listed as clean would be those that have the cloven hoof and that chew the cud. And these animals are all herbivores. And they chew the cud. That means they regurgitate what they have eaten and chew it again. But the biblical version of chewing the cud is wider than the scientific one that is used in science today, in zoology, for example.
Well, explain that to us.
Well, if you take an animal that chews the cud, scientifically, it would be an animal with a rumen. A cow and all the ungulates and sheep and goats, they have a pre-stomach, which is called the rumen, in which bacterial fermentation takes place. So when the animals eat the grasses or the leaves that are high in cellulose, they are unable to digest these without the bacteria. So the bacteria produce enzymes like cellulase, and these digest the cellulose and make it available to the animals. Plus, the bacteria also, because they are living organisms, produce their own proteins and so augment the protein component of these animals' diets. And these nutrients pass straight through the intestine and are then discarded. And those animals are regarded as clean. They eat from the very lowest trophic level. They have the least accumulation of toxins if they stick to that particular regime.
Well, how do you define dividing the hoof?
Well, there's an interesting analogy. You see, some animals actually have a rumen, but they don't have a divided hoof. For example, the camel. The camel has a broad-based foot, which is somewhat different to an ungulate, but it has a rumen. So scientifically, one would imagine that the camel is eating just like the cow is eating, and it has a rumen, so it does the same things. But the camel is adapted to a new situation which probably didn't exist prior to the fall, and that is that it's adapted to desert environments. And as such, it has developed abilities to conserve water, and it can actually retain urea. And urea is, in these creatures, is actually recycled straight back to the rumen, where they are converted into proteins by the bacteria again. But the levels of toxins, because this creature is able to retain these rather than secrete them or excrete them, which would be associated with a loss of water, makes them animals that have higher levels of toxins than otherwise.
So a camel doesn't excrete very much?
Well, it can retain toxic compounds to a higher level than other organisms. For example, if we go into a desert environment and we are heat loaded, then we would have to sweat. The camel, to prevent water loss, does not sweat to the same extent as we would, and so it has the ability to actually have its temperature increase. Mm-hmm. And this again is associated with less excretion, and therefore you have higher toxic loads.
So that toxic urea then is dissipated through the flesh of the animal?
Absolutely. If you take a horse, it doesn't have a split hoof. Now, a horse doesn't have a rumen like a cow has. So the digestion and fermentation, just as in the case of a rabbit, takes place at the end of the intestine. So in nature, horses are coprophages, just like rabbits are coprophages.
Now, what's a coprophage?
A coprophage is an organism that has to eat its own excreta. You see, the fermentation and the production of the bacteria now takes place at the end of the intestine, and the only way to absorb it would be to pass it back through the intestine. No, it can't put it into reverse peristalsis, so it goes the other route, and rabbits produce two kinds of feces. The one is a hard pellet, which is discarded, and the other one is the soft contents of the cecum, which is taken directly off the anus and recycled into the body.
So it licks it back into its body.
It licks it back into its body and re-ingests it, so this is like chewing the cud, eating what it ate before, except, of course, that it's gone the entire route now, which means that compounds like bile salts, secondary bile salts, all of those would be in there as well, and those tend to be carcinogenic. So these creatures are listed as unclean, and I think for very good reasons.
Yes. Well, what about the fish? Say, take shark.
Well, a shark is an animal that is adapted to the marine environment, and the marine environment has a very high salt load. The concentration of the sea is normally about 2/3 higher than the salt concentration of fishes living in the ocean. And the shark also has a lower salt content than the sea. Now, this is problematic. This means because the concentration in the ocean is higher than the concentration in the shark, water by osmosis would tend to leave the shark and it would dehydrate.
Like a dried up old prune.
Or like a dried up old prune. Now, fish with fins and scales in the ocean, they solve this problem by drinking the water and then desalinating it through their gills. They have special salt glands that excrete the salt, but the shark can't do that. It has a little salt gland at the end of the rectum where it gets rid of some of the salt, but in order to solve its water problem, it actually retains urea. So whereas normally the animals get rid of the urea, this one retains it, and it has special reabsorption in the kidney to retain it to a very high level, so that it actually has a higher osmotic concentration than the ocean by increasing the urea levels, and then it absorbs water by osmosis. Now that, of course, makes the animal toxic.
Mm-hmm.
Urea is something that you wish to excrete, and we get rid of it through our kidneys on a daily basis, but the shark retains it. So the old custom of taking shark fin soup is you cut off the shark fin and they dried it, and basically the urea crystallizes. So what you have is like a tea bag of urea, and you reconstitute it by putting it into hot water. Then basically you have a solution that is rich in urea, and there would be a lot cheaper ways of getting it than having shark fin soup.
Like stock food, I guess.
Yes, like stock food, but of
cubes of stock food.
Yes, but of a somewhat more distasteful nature.
Well, the reason I mentioned shark is because not only for the soup that many people love, in fact, it's not only something which is obviously not so good for us, but it's you're paying for it through the nose.
Absolutely.
Because it's a very, very expensive soup, you know, shark fin soup.
Very expensive.
And also, people eat that in the general fish and chip shop. When you go down and buy fish and chips, very often the fish that is served is shark, which, of course, comes under the category of this high toxic fish.
That's right. You know, in the past, they used to discard the rest of the shark and only use the fin. But since they have these freezing capabilities, they keep the shark because it tended to rot very easily. That's another feature about these unclean creatures. Now, those creatures also that are listed here as unclean that don't have scales,
yes,
those are normally scavengers. All the marine organisms that have either very loose scales or no scales fall into the category of scavenger or high carnivore. In other words, they feed off the highest trophic levels and have the highest accumulation of toxins.